In a town shaped by the subtle machinations and political intrigue of its guilds, it's reassuring to see a goblin waving his torch and screaming about some nonsense or other.
Hey gang, just to let you know, you can now use the promo code MTGMudsta, all caps, at flipsidegaming.com and originalmagicart.store. Using the code gets you 10% off orders $10 or more, and you get to help out the channel at the same time. Also, just so you know, all orders over $10 or more until January 28th, 2019 at 11:59 p.m. will be entered to win their chance at a Ravnica Allegiance booster box. It's 1 entry per person, so good luck and be sure to let me know what you open. Welcome to the inaugural episode of Lunchtime Legacy. This series will help showcase one of my second favorite formats, Legacy. This series is still being fine-tuned as I fix things like the angle of the dangle of my camera, the overall layout, and my narration. If you have any thoughts or comments on those matters, please leave them in the comments below. Your feedback is invaluable as I improve these videos. Today's best of 3 has Cedric playing his blue-black Reanimator deck, and Thomas playing his Grixis control. Game 1, Cedric keeps 2 Lotus Petals, Pithing Needle, Exhume, Entomb, Duress, and Brainstorm. Thomas keeps a Swamp, 2 Polluted Deltas, Force of Will, Brainstorm, Ponder, and Spell Pierce. Cedric wins the die roll and starts us off. Cedric plays a Lotus Petal, and then another Petal, cracking the second to cast Brainstorm. He resolves the Brainstorm, and then plays a Polluted Delta, passing. Thomas plays a Polluted Delta as well, and he passes. At the end of turn, Cedric cracks his Polluted Delta, taking 1 to go and find an Underground Sea. He then casts an Entomb with it, and this time Thomas decides to crack his Delta. He finds his own Underground Sea, and taps it to cast a Spell Pierce, putting it into the Entomb. Cedric draws for turn, and he casts Careful Study, drawing 2 and discarding 2. We then see another Polluted Delta, and he passes to Thomas. Thomas also plays a Polluted Delta as well, and he taps his Underground Sea to cast a Ponder. He gets to rearrange the top 3, and then draws a card. Cedric draws for turn, and passes. Thomas plays a Swamp in his turn, and passes. Cedric draws, and passes. At the end of turn, we see a Brainstorm from Thomas. He draws and puts 2 cards back, then cracks his Polluted Delta. He grabs a Badlands and shuffles away the cards he'd put back with his Brainstorm. For Thomas's turn, he plays a Bloodstained Mire, and he passes. Cedric plays a Flooded Strand, and passes. Thomas plays a Polluted Delta, passing. Cedric draws, and passes. Thomas casts Preordain in his main phase, scrying 2 and keeping 1 on top while bottoming the other. He then draws a card, and Thomas then cracks his Delta, taking 1 to go and find an island. We then see him cast a Baleful Strix, and it hits the field and draws Thomas a card. Cedric draws for turn, and passes. Thomas draws, and plays a Scalding Tarn. Moving to combat, the Strix deals 1 to Cedric. Cedric draws, and passes. At the end of turn, Thomas flashes in a Snapcaster Mage, giving his Brainstorm flashback. He casts it, and after putting the 2 back, cracks the Tarn to go and find a land. Thomas plays another Scalding Tarn for his turn, and he moves to combat, hitting Cedric for 3. In his second main phase, Thomas then resolves to Jace the Mind Sculptor. He upticks the Planeswalker to Fate Seal Cedric. He looks at the top card and bottoms it. At the end of turn, Cedric cracks his Flooded Strand to go and find an island. Cedric draws, and he passes turn. He has more than 7 cards in hand at the end of his turn, and we see him discard a Grizzlebrand. Thomas draws, and he upticks Jace, Fate Sealing Cedric once more. He bottoms the card again, and hits Cedric for 2 with the Snapcaster Mage. Cedric draws for turn, and before moving out of the draw step, Thomas flashes in Vendilion Clique. He looks at Cedric's hand, and has Cedric bottom the Exhume, and then draw a card. Cedric realizes he probably can't fight through Thomas's hand of counters, and we move to game 2 with the guys sideboarding in some cards. Thomas decides to bring in 2 Surgical Extractions, a Grafdigger's Cage, 2 Thoughtseize, a Pyroblast, and Diabolic Edict. Cedric decides to bring in a Chains of Vapor, Show and Tell, and a Flusterstorm. For game 2, Cedric keeps 2 Entombs, Reanimate, Underground Sea, and 3 Force of Wills. Thomas keeps a Gurmag Angler, Pyroblast, Inquisition of Kozilek, Diabolic Edict, Scalding Tarn, Polluted Delta, and Engineered Explosives. Having lost Game 1, Cedric starts Game 2. Cedric plays an Underground Sea, already tapped to pay for his Entomb. This resolves, and he goes to his library and puts Iona to his graveyard. Thomas draws, and he plays a Swamp. He then casts an Inquisition of Kozilek, which gets countered by Cedric's Force of Will, which he plays by exiling another Force of Will and taking 1 life. Cedric draws for turn, and he plays an Underground Sea. He moves to cast Reanimate, targeting Iona. It resolves, which has Cedric losing 10. As Iona enters, Cedric names black. Thomas draws and plays a Scalding Tarn. He passes, and at the end of turn, Cedric casts his second Entomb. This time he finds and bins a Grizzlebrand. Cedric draws for turn, and he hits Thomas for 7, passing. Thomas draws, and he plays a Polluted Delta, also passing. Cedric draws for turn, and at the end of the draw step, Thomas cracks his 2 fetches to go and grab an island and an Underground Sea. He flashes in the Vendilion Click once more, but this time targets himself. He bottoms a Gurmag Angler, and he draws a card. Cedric then moves to combat, and the Vendilion Click stops Iona for a turn, and Cedric then passes. Thomas draws, and he passes. Cedric draws for turn, and he smacks Thomas for 7 with Iona. Thomas draws for turn, but with no real way to deal with Iona, we move to Game 3. For Game 3, Cedric keeps a Thoughtseize, a Force of Will, a Brainstorm, an Exhume, a Swamp, Grizzlebrand, and Show and Tell. Thomas keeps Force of Will, Baleful Strix, Spell Pierce, Surgical Extraction, a Brainstorm, and 2 Polluted Deltas. Since Thomas lost, he starts us off. Thomas plays a Polluted Delta, and he passes. Cedric draws, and he plays a Swamp. He casts Duress, which prompts Thomas to sacrifice his Polluted Delta. Thomas grabs an Underground Sea, and he counters the Duress with a Spell Pierce. Thomas draws, and plays another Polluted Delta, cracking it immediately this time. He grabs a Badlands, and Baleful Strix hits the field, drawing Thomas a card. Cedric draws, and he passes. Thomas plays a Scalding Tarn, and hits Cedric for 1 with the Strix. We then see another Strix in his second main phase, and it draws him a card. Thomas then cracks his Scalding Tarn to go and find another Underground Sea. This lets him cast an Inquisition of Kozilek, which forces Cedric to discard his Brainstorm. Cedric draws for turn, and casts Thoughtseize. He forces Thomas to discard a Surgical Extraction, and passes. Thomas draws and hits Cedric for 2. He then casts a Ponder, and rearranges the top 3, and draws a card. Thomas then casts his own Thoughtseize, and forces Cedric to discard Show and Tell. Cedric draws for turn, and passes. Thomas draws, and hits Cedric for 2, passing. Cedric draws, and he passes. Thomas draws, and hits Cedric again for 2. His second main phase has him casting another Ponder, and he rearranges the top 3, and draws a card. Thomas then casts a Grafdigger's Cage, which Cedric tries to counter by casting Force of Will, taking 1 and exiling his second Force. Thomas tries to counter the Force of Will with his own Force of Will by exiling a Ponder. Cedric is ready for this though, countering the opposing Force of Will with another one of his Force of Wills, taking 1 and exiling a Brainstorm this time. And with nothing else, Thomas passes. Cedric draws for turn, and he plays an Underground Sea, passing. Thomas draws and hits Cedric again for 2. We then see another Ponder hit the stack, and he rearranges the top 3, drawing a card. Cedric draws, and he passes. Thomas draws for turn, and he hits Cedric for 2, passing. Cedric draws and casts Pything Needle, naming Jace the Mind Sculptor as it enters. Thomas draws and hits Cedric for 2. Cedric draws and knows when he's beat, conceding to Thomas. Game review time. So, much like I do with my DH games, I'm going to review these games, but bear in mind, I'm no Legacy expert. From what I could see, the long game definitely seemed to favor Thomas, and in both Game 1 and 3, when Cedric wasn't able to get fast mana and be able to reanimate a creature early on, he seemed to struggle. On the flip side, if he was able to get something out early enough, he basically won the game, as illustrated by Game 2 when Iona resolved and basically locked Thomas out. Beyond that, it seemed very cut and dry when it comes to cards like Brainstorm being good and Force of Will being an excellent counterspell. I really love the format. It has a lot of unique and interesting decks that you really can't mimic in things like Modern or Standard. And I'd also like to extend a big thank you to Cedric and his wife for allowing us to take over his kitchen for an evening. And for Cedric himself for organizing a bunch of other Legacy players for joining us. I was able to film a bunch of different games with different decks, but unfortunately they're all at the same angle, which is something I want to work on moving forward. But anyway, like I said, if you guys have any kind of suggestions or ways so I can improve this, please let me know in the comments below. Please be sure to tune in every Monday and Thursday at 11 AM Eastern Standard Time for a guaranteed new video. You can also follow me on Twitter at MTGMudsta. You can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/mtgmudsta. And lastly, you can check me out when I stream at twitch.tv/mtgmudsta. This video is brought to you in support by my patrons. If you're looking for a way to help out the channel, please be sure to visit the link below. Thank you all for watching this video, and don't forget, friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.